I've been around a while. You can probably see that. But I'm coming over from Western Australia, and it's a different country over there, and we've had a bit of a welcome to country. But part of what we're going to be talking about really is to do with the Australian standard AS4970, but it's a little bit broader than that too. And hopefully we'll have a bit of time just for some Q&A as well. We'll see how it goes. How do I set this to move? There we go. So a few things today. What I'd like to introduce really is a bit of a measure on how we measure success really in what we do in arboriculture, in the landscape. And also how the framework, how we make decisions, the decision-making process, if you like, that's part of every day really, and that's relevant to. I'm looking here at counsellors, accountants, engineers, and other professions. At the end of the day, this is, we're a pretty close sort of group. We all deal with trees and we know a lot of stuff about trees. But really we're trying to sell that message more often than not to other parties who know very little, but they actually make decisions that they have quite an influence really on what it is that we do. And also, hopefully, we're going to give you some direction that enables these other people to be champions as well. It's not just us being champions around trees, it's getting other people involved, and it's the same people, the counsellors, accountants, engineers, people the professions that really don't know a great deal about trees technically, but who make a lot of decisions that strongly influence trees. So how do we measure success? And there's many things to sort of look at here. There's trees, water, people, the environment, different ways of being able to look at things. And we're mainly talking about trees here today. It's not trying to cover all these other things. And yes, I'll just stick with that. And to start with, you've probably all seen this graph, the Hitchmore graph. Everybody seen this before? Yeah? And what's important about this, just a few things just to get things sort of started, and this is sort of it relates to everything we're talking about really, but what I wanted to point out, if I can get this to work. Oh, it doesn't work on the screen. There we go, it doesn't matter. Oh, I've changed slides. But it's about at the beginning of things, for new tree plantings, what happens more often than not is that we have a lot of mishaps and trees that just don't really get to survive. And each one of these little sort of walking sticks, if you like, it's pretty typical. We end up having 2 or 3 of these for every planting hole. More often than not, there's a couple of times we have to put a tree in there before we get one that's really going to be successful. And look, in Western Australia, I can tell you that there would be, for the average, is that you end up with 4 or 5 trees getting planted in that same hole before you can get one that will reach maturity, 15, 20 years of age, or the first stage of maturity, really. And yeah, the other thing is that what we're looking at the top of the big green line, essentially, most of the stuff, AS4970, we're sort of only talking about trees that are at their top value. At the end of the day, trees do get old, they die just like people do. And part of this is not so much necessarily about the cost of maintenance. A lot of it's to do with risk, a perceived risk, and how you might manage that risk. And so the prices go up, if you like, in how to manage that. But the really important factor here is, as well, you have the trees that really just survive. They don't die. And we have a lot of those in the landscape too. And I wouldn't call those successful trees, but they're trees that actually serve a purpose. They just don't die. It takes them 20, 30 years. Am I okay?
Keep going.
Anyhow, so we're really dealing with two sort of scenarios here, with new trees as well as old trees. And the sort of thing that we want on the left-hand side of the screen there is the thing that we tend to not get. Most of the time, after 3 to 7 years, we end up with trees that look a bit dodgy. They still survive, still there, but and some that are, well, they just really haven't survived at all. And in Vic Park, they actually did a bit of an analysis on this, and this was from one of the American universities. But by and large, every 10 years, they were finding on average they're having to replace trees. And that's a pretty common cycle. I'm not sure just how that works here, but I'll be betting that it is not an uncommon occurrence. And one of the reasons I think this is a bit of a slip up is that at the end of the day, we value the green stuff that sits above the ground. But in actual fact, the investment we make in trees is what's below ground. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that during the course today, and hopefully get some questions about that too. But in planting for trees, we should be planting for space for them to grow below ground. And once in targeting that, I think we'll start addressing a whole lot of the issues that keep arising. But in order to sort of appreciate that, a few things about just the circumstances that trees come from when we talk about root systems and what's going on below ground. And essentially they're those trees that, the native landscape that were imposing, were moving into that, developing estates and those sorts of things. But these are trees that have got a natural root system that we're starting to interfere with. In the middle there are new tree plantings in urban areas and what have you. Anyhow, in the middle there, it's new tree plantings, and you've got old trees that get transplanted that are old trees being put into new spaces, and at the end of the day, they're no different to a new tree. Yeah, in many ways, they're no different to a new tree, and what they're doing, in the fact that they've got to readapt to whatever it is, whatever space we put them into. And I'm talking about below ground soil space, and then there's the third lot, which are what we inherit. And most of you in local government, you're dealing with an inherited landscape. There's things that people have done it before and planted trees, and trees have adapted, and to whatever extent they've been successful, that's what you're dealing with. But they've got modified root systems that have adapted to those local circumstances. So when you think about it, we've got, this is a tree that's been there a long time, and we start encroaching and pinching things from it, that's root system. New tree plantings where we cut a hole in the concrete and quite often plant a tree and think that's enough. We're not really accommodating for the right amount of space. And then we've got existing trees where you don't know where the root system is. And that will change. And so just about that is that roots really will go to where they're invited. They don't have any IQ, there's no intelligence, the root doesn't know anything. It doesn't know that there's a service over there, it just happens to take the path of least resistance, and it's opportunistic. Where things are good, roots proliferate. And so we tend to see that as being, trees taking advantage of things. But for this, I'm really just talking about our coastal sands in WA, pardon me. And diagrammatically, it's just sort of showing the circumstances that arise there. We've got a very shallow root plate that extends a long way. Might have some sinker roots that stabilise the tree. But when you get into an urban context, roots will follow where there's been disturbance, where there's pathways. We have layers of soil. I'm sure you have the same here too, where development immediately starts with bulldozing what's there, and then you start putting new layers of things on top, and eventually you have the offal from the road construction or whatever it might be, and that becomes your base for planting a tree. And we tend to think of water as being a real influencer of roots, but by and large, water without air is toxic. So air's got a lot to do with where roots grow. Looking at these diagrams, you can see quite clearly where there's been aerated soils, and that strongly influences where roots grow. And I guess the important thing here is that the mechanics of the soil, the physical attributes, they far outweigh any genetic coding that the tree might have. Like in this instance, you've got your sinker roots, for example, just using this as an example, but sinker roots on what's a naturally undisturbed, natural environment for a tree. Put it into an urban setting, you don't get those sinker roots to the same extent. You end up with a root system that's far shallower, tends to be radially more dependent, and it can follow paths that run for miles along surfaces or where there's opportunity. So that's a stronger influence than anything that's genetically coded into the tree. And the other is that root systems, the best thought of really as being a stomach flipped inside out. We actually have control of what goes in. We heard a bit about exercising and stuff this morning. But our diets are another thing that, we can control what goes in. We've got a stomach that digests everything. For a tree, it's flipped out the other way. Everything, what other people put in the ground actually is what they get to use, and pardon me, all the microbes, all the other mechanisms that are in the soil is essentially the stomach, if you like, of a tree and how it utilises it. Trees exude things into the soil to create all the circumstances that it wants. So all the bacteria, the same sort of stuff that goes on in a gut, ends up really being flipped inside out, and that's where a root system is. And part of this about the pink zones here are are really the zones of influence, where you'll have mycorrhizal, other things. In the heavier soils, and there tends to be several metres quite often of where water's being influenced by roots that are sitting up in the higher part of the soil profile. There's lots of data and research that shows all those sorts of things. And that leads us to really how we go about protecting existing trees in the Australian standard. And there's a few things I'd like to run through on that. And here, Cav, you guys have already done a fair bit of research to look at this, and a couple of interesting things between the common misconceptions and the areas of improvement. And I think this was done in 2020. Yeah, 2020. And what's interesting here is a few things. The big ticket, the 63% of misconception around the encroachment part of the Australian standard. Yet when it comes to things that could be improved, there's only half of, 40% of that, or 50% of that, that don't see that really being a problem. That in itself is actually a problem. We think it's actually something we misunderstand. We don't really know it that well, but we're sort of brushing it off as being something that doesn't matter so much. And in actual fact, I think it does. We'll talk about that. And the other is, let me put my glasses on, to do with the types of reporting. And yeah, the misconception is around that is a fairly low percentage, but in terms of improvement, it's seen as being something that needs a lot of improvement. And that's true enough, it does. And the, what is it, NDI methods, and root pruning, and here we are, we see it as being, we don't really understand what it means, but we think we need to improve on that a lot. So there, just a bit of a start. But the AS497 and the way that it works here, it's recognising, and most of you already know this, so I'm not trying to, I just need to cover a few things so that I know that I've said them in a way. But the model itself is really just fictitious. It's not about a real tree. It's just about something that, by and large, it'll 99.9% of the trees in Australia will survive if you work on these radiuses and things around trees. But the protection zone is three-dimensional. It's not just a circle on a plan. And it provides a guide. The AS4970 is just a guide, really, on the sorts of things that should be hold points. And it helps develop the specifications that are required for other people to understand what to do, basically. And so just seeing it in a three-dimensional sense, and this is typical of a tree in Perth sandy soils in a three-dimensional context. But it's important to actually just appreciate that it is three-dimensional. And by and large, all it's saying is if you stay outside that 12 times dBH, that things are fine. The tree will be okay. And by and large, it will be. But what it's also saying is if you're going to move inside that space, just have the right advice and get the right information about what it is that you're doing. And I think that's an area where we need to work on a little bit. Responding to site-specific conditions is what there's about, the species type, its traits and tolerances, those sorts of things, the location of the specific growing conditions that might be applicable, and the impacts on the environment, those sorts of things, generally speaking. But at the end of the day, you've got your nominal TPZ, which is the circle around a tree. When you actually start doing a bit of an analysis of the site itself and the tree circumstance, you can have something like this where it's totally different. It can even have roots outside the circle. It doesn't have to necessarily join up. You can have areas that are well outside of what's a circle and not actually continuous root zones being part of this. And that's, when you think about this, that's part of our solution in many ways too, of how to get trees to be successful in the landscape. But in doing this, in order to get to this second work-specific site, we really need to verify what's going on. What is it? Where are the roots? What structures have we got there that are really influencing this, that you can say, well, this is a pretty safe zone, there's not going to be many roots, or it could be no roots. Roads and things like that have a huge influence on where roots will grow. In heavier soils, you've got a little more depth associated with where roots will tend to be at times, finer roots. But there's a lot of things that can be done here. To do with encroachment, even the brochure that you guys have got here on this, it sort of targets the wrong message in a way. It's, here we are showing here on the tree that encroachment's actually to do with a fictitious circle. We really should be verifying what it is that we're talking about before we start talking about encroachment, I think. And the process that we're looking at here to do with the tree assessments that are being done, in all fairness, all we're doing, we're looking at the end of results, at the end of people making their own decisions, finally we're doing an impact assessment. Wow, I'm not sure that's the smartest way to go, really. But that's not your fault, that's just a system that we're all sort of stuck into. But I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. In that, the system that's being looked at here, it's not going to work with it. But you can, on the left-hand side, so you've got the survey, and you've got the zones here shown in blue in the in the CAV drawing, where there's arboricultural input. In actual fact, it starts with master planning. That's where the input needs to be in the first instance. Then when you get to do your preliminary tree assessments, that's fine, same. But the biggest factor here, the one that I think is most influential, is to do with the ongoing review of... sorry. I arrived very late last night and ended up spending a few hours getting this finished. And I think my voice is suffering. But anyhow, the collaborative review process is, of all things, that's probably the most pivotal in being able to get to what is a final design that you can actually work to for specifications. So the process here, and I'm not sure how it goes in Victoria, but in WA we have the 5%, 50%, 80% or 85% designs. And once you get to 85%, that's when you can actually have specifications being drawn up. You virtually know what you're dealing with. But in order to get there, there's input into what other parties are trying to do or what they're trying to design. But an arborist needs to have a foot in the door here and be able to influence and just recognise for the other people, look, if you did this, these are the consequences. We can start quantifying things. But we can't quantify things from a circle. We've got to go inside this circle, know what it is that we're talking about, to then be able to influence the design elements. And that just goes from 5% is just conceptual, to 50%, which looks like this is getting pretty real, to 85% or 80% that is for doing the final specifications. Everybody then understands what they're dealing with. Then that goes through to get its final sort of assessment, the what's it called? The arboricultural impact assessment. And so you're doing that on what is pretty much a draft and getting the base information together, and that becomes part of the submission. Now for you guys, the way that you've got the CAV set up here, which is fine, but essentially it's saying all this gets approved, and once it's approved, once we've got a permission to actually carry on and do the development, that's when you do all your assessments. It's sort of too late. And one of the reasons it's too late is because nobody's allocated a budget to do any of these sorts of things. So there's this constant sort of pulling and tossing and turning to try and get things across the line. I'll give you, there's a case study I'll give you a quick look at a bit later. Hopefully time doesn't run out. But anyhow, that's a really important difference, being able to have enough input so that the design review is actually refining what it is that we know about the tree and what the plan is, what the development plan might be. So I'll just run through some of these things quickly. So the master planning, which is to do with local structure plans. And so you're having an input into that zone, into those sorts of things. But there's a level of community engagement that needs to happen here too. And as arborists, we need to be able to inform people about, well, if you make these sorts of decisions in a general sense in your community, these are the sorts of implications. It's not just about species selection and that sort of stuff. The environmental controls are another thing too, with fires, fire breaks. They're all things that have a really strong influence on where trees can be put or where trees are going to be lost. And they're very, very influential people, as well as the urban forest strategy that you might be trying to be putting into play. So again, ARB input into that. Preliminary tree assessments, all these, so you're doing your site surveys, the basic stuff, making recommendations. You've got some idea of what might be proposed, but quite often it's like this diagram. The site's already been cleared. Were you involved? Was ARB involved in who decided which trees were going to stay and go here? Quite often that's done by other people that really don't know much about trees at all, and we need to be there. The 15, 50 and 80%, I've already mentioned about those. But it's recognising that, there's different stages, the civils, the sort of the demolition, the clearing that needs to happen, the civil works, the new pipe works and all that sort of stuff that needs to go in. They're all things that sort of sit separate. Then people come along and they start doing their building things. They need to be have a different lot of specifications really. And then you've got your landscapers that come in and irrigation people who dig trenches and cut through root systems as if it's terrific for the tree, but quite often it's more destructive than not. That's all part of the process to get a acceptance. You have your ARB impact assessments, and again, just talk about those demolition forward works, construction, landscaping works. And they're just drafts. At this stage, these are just drafts. So you know what you're meant to be doing, and you've got an idea, you think this is how it's all going to work, and everybody's agreeing that all these things can be done. Then you get your final management plan and the specifications, and this is where you're confirming what it is, how construction is going to be done. There are different ways that things can be done, and quite often we don't have any control. We don't allow ourselves to have any control. We're not at the table to talk about these things. And the example I've got there is, this is a cloisters. It's in St George's Terrace. City of Perth had this valued at somewhere between $2 and $3 million, this tree. It's just a Ficus rubiginosa, Jackson Bay fig. But it's been there a long time. It's served us very well. It's a beautiful little tree in a nice little nook. And the circle here is just to demonstrate how things can vary. The yellow circle, the indicative TPZ, the theoretical one. In actual fact, there was that little red garden bed. That's all there was around this tree. And what's in blue is what we verified was where there's root zone. It makes no sense to a circle, very different. And part of that garden bed, now you'd think, it's a garden bed, surely it's going to be occupied by roots. And it's not. What's been put back in there, the fill, it's just been toxic crap. Even roots won't grow in it. It's not compacted, it's just rubbish. So roots are just avoiding that space. Turns out that top diagonal line, it's actually a basement. There's a three-storey deep car park, and that's a basement line around there. And the same along this edge in the up and down the vertical. That's actual basement for building. So there's certainly not going to be roots there. That's where the theoretical circle around a tree sort of starts to not really make sense. You've got to verify these sorts of things, I think, to be able to make sense of it. Then you've got construction, where you've got, for me here, there's two realms that need to be thought about. One is that you've got a project arboriculturist or an arborist who's beholden to the client. The client could be the local authority who's novated this site to a developer to do what he needs to do, to then take it back again later on. So somebody needs to represent their interests. Could be a private client and a citizen, don't know. But then you've got your project arborist who's really beholden to the builder. He's engaged by the builder. He's beholden to the builder. He'll get shafted by the builder. So you've got to have, there's a level of protection that needs to happen there. And then you've got, at the end of the thing, you have defects liability period, handover, and levels of reporting and practical completion, and your final completion certifications that become part of that process. But going back to the two types of arborists here, You know, there's definitely two power plays that are going on, and it's very difficult to actually be in both camps without being compromised, because who's paying you? It becomes the real question here, and quite often it's been pushed into the builder being the guy who's going to pay your bills, and so you end up really professionally being beholden to that group. For project management and the project arborist, in this sense, would be they understand the whole points. They're doing quality control over things that are going on and what other people are doing, supervision to some extent. They're also dealing with variations. There's hardly ever not a variation of some sort in any project. And so they're looking at, well, what's the implications for the tree and how do we manage that? Otherwise, those things just get driven by a dollar and other people and their thoughts on things. And then there's contractor meetings and just staying ahead of the game. So as things progress, the project arborist, he's just the guy doing all the jobs that need to be done, whether it's pruning or root zone remediation, interpreting site plans and drawings, monitoring, those sorts of things. You know, that's another level, but it's one that's beholden to very much to the contractor or to the builder who's doing things. So the things that underpin good tree outcomes, not necessarily in the right order here, but there's return on investment, and just where is that? We'll talk about that. We already have to some extent with the recognising where the root zones need to be in our urban spaces. But there's a chain of events for tree success, and just the way we think about things, absolutes and variables, myths and facts, planning design, field requirements, and the art of the possible is something that we need to entertain a little bit more. But at the end of the day, we want this nice avenue of trees, say. Not everybody wants exactly that, but you know, that's the sort of thing that we want. But what we end up, in order to get that, it really is there's these interdependent chain of events that happen. They start from planning, the planning, design and documentation, and what happens through construction. We've sort of just been talking about all those. But look at the timeframes too. There's generally 1 or 2 years that it takes to get all the documentation and stuff put together, getting the plans up to a point of where we can now specify things as in the design. Then there's the documentation that goes, or the documentation that goes is the result of that. That documentation is actual fact your tender documents. It's the script for how people like the bobcat operator, like the contractor himself and other parties, what they need to do. It's a script. It gives them information on what to do. In that, you've done all the observations, you know what the ground's like, you know what the circumstances are for the tree, so you can actually put those into specifications for other people to follow. Otherwise, the bobcat operator is making a decision about what to do with the tree, or the plumber. They've all got their own thoughts on this, and we know that most of the time they don't get it right. But from a contractual point of view too, the planning, there's a division between who does the planning and who does the design, the documentation. Quite often there can be those top 3 elements there could be 3 totally independent people taking on each of those areas. So each time that changes, it goes to another party that rethinks the whole thing. They always want to reassess, they always want to recheck the accountability of, or the accounts, the costs and those sorts of things too. So the quality of things that start in terms of the original design quite often get compromised as you get towards documentation, because everybody wants to be able to save a dollar, basically. But also too, and even in the construction phases, there are different contracts for different things. So by the end of the day, most of you guys are possibly actually just managing contracts rather than an outcome. You're just dealing with, and people are doing their bit in the contract, but they're just dealing with the contract, not with the outcome that they're meant to, that you're trying to achieve. They're just ticking with their contract. And so it becomes very difficult to get a good or continuity from start to finish. It's a real challenge. But we're all stuck with that challenge. And I'm not saying we've got to change it, but we do need to know how to live within it. And we'll firstly recognise where we are in that chain of events and how we might be an influencer in other areas too. But the timelines here, the 1 or 2 years, generally construction 2 to 5 years, that phase. And then you've got handover and things that are going on for another 25 years. This is a real long cycle. So keeping the chain strong. And one of the things is the way that we think, and is, again, about absolutes and variables. A lot of the professions that we deal with, actually, things have to be absolutely right or wrong. Maths and all those sorts of things, engineers, even a lot of our soil sciences and things, they're trying to eliminate all the variables to be able to give you something that's absolute. Well, quite often when you start dealing with or get rid of those variables, the absolutes are only true in a very narrow band of circumstance. So, but we use those quite often scientifically to say, well, this is what applies. Well, it's a crock of shit. Most of the time it's such a narrow band that it's only true in that circumstance. We shouldn't be applying it generally. But here we are, arboriculture, horticulture, everything's a variable, everything's dynamic, it changes. Even soil, organics in the soil changes the nature of the soil, changes the fertility, changes the permeability, a whole lot of things. But we're used to dealing with that. But a lot of these other professions we deal with don't know how to deal with that. Be aware. Natural systems, urban systems, environmental science, and we have a lot of this in Perth where the rules for environmentals that are applied to a natural setting or a natural system are being imposed on an individual tree. The circumstances are so different, you can't do that. And so in terms of broader communities, environmental science is very good, very clever. There's great research and good value there. But modern arboriculture is where we're really trained to understand the individual tree and its circumstances. The environmental people don't really get that. They've only got this broad set of rules they're trying to stamp on an individual tree, and quite often it just doesn't work. We need to be aware of it. Myths and facts. Oh dear. I wonder if I got the wrong thing here. Doesn't matter. It was it's that planning, design, and in the field. So it's about thinking smarter in some of the decision making. And just a couple of quick things to go through. You might already know this, but again, I'm just making sure that we've got common knowledge in what we're doing here. But the leaves in the tree, they're just solar panels that actually energise and grow a root system. Nothing more. No roots, no tree. You've got a tree with no roots, you have nothing. It doesn't work. So, but just think of it in that context. They're just solar panels that run the show. Energise the show, that's all they are. Root systems, we'll talk more about those shortly, but dimorphic root systems, things that can happen. But the middle slide here is that the same tree will grow roots differently in a sandy soil to a clay soil. It's not as though they grow the same. Just the mechanics of a soil, the characteristics of a soil will very much influence, how roots develop. And I guess just that thought that roots don't compete with gravity. They're different to branches because they just don't have to compete with gravity. So they can do all sorts of things. They're good under tension, but they're not good flapping up and down. And as arborists involved in this area, there's a lot of things that we need to understand. Understand our soils and the site soils and the profiles, pretty much down to at least a metre. We should be understanding what's going on there. That tells us a lot about where roots will grow or won't grow. Water availability, those sorts of things. Understanding the site limitations, compaction's a big one, and no matter where we are, whether it's sand or a clay or whatever it is, sand and bulk densities and those sorts of things become a big factor. I won't spend too much time on these, so I think we're going to run out of time. But the phenology of trees, the seasonal things, how they actually respond to what's going on, how they change over time. They're important elements to bring into the project, particularly time, tree time and project time. We're on a budget, we've got to have it finished by December. Well, trees don't respond to that. Trees don't respond to the share market, let alone what's going on in a project. The two things are very different. Tree time, what happens for a tree? Scratch myself, 2 weeks, that little scab is healed up. For a tree, it could take 2 years. Same thing. So it's time and how it changes things. The site limitations, the stuff that we do around trees, and then it's just death by 1,000 cuts quite often, and then things like this happen and we say, oh gee, the tree's no good. Well, that's been 10 years of abuse around this tree that's finally, it's just fallen over really for nothing more than just it was a bit windy. Understanding the tree needs, what they need to grow and survive. the volume, the rootable soil volume for a tree, how we calculate that and how we deal with that. At the end of the day, what we see there is that cube, if you like, sitting underneath the tree. I think there's those sorts of spaces are things that I think we can allocate and work with and be much smarter in the way that we do things around that space, so that we're not only protecting tree roots, but we're also protecting all the infrastructure from the damage that tree roots might cause as well. Amenity values and expectations, again, that earlier graph, but just comparing that with a building. Building, day one, by the time it's completed, highest value, depreciates over time. That's the way the system works. But for trees, we've got an asset that grows and increases in value for a period of time. Understanding tree canopy cover. Again, there's so many landscape architects that talk about these big trees that are, a crepe myrtle or a paperbark. Wow, it's not a big tree. We're being sold a dud quite often for some of these things, but people just don't get what a big tree really means. And then, we look at the graph earlier, quite often we're expecting this thing to get to at least 10 metres, but it only ever gets to 5 or 6. But we call that good enough, but it's not. We're selling the wrong thing. So knowing what the sizes are and what you should be expecting, I think is a really important part here. And what underpins that quite often is just the quality of trees, the root systems that go with those trees. That's what makes the difference as to whether you get what you want or what you've been selling, if you like, as an idea or a concept, or not. And there's there's AS2303 that talks about that. But there's a lot of things within the scope of 303 that just don't get sorted, don't get done very well, purely for $1. So we've got to be really on top of that, I think, a lot more than we currently are to get the right outcomes. Species selection, for me, species selection is about, you only do that once you know what the site conditions are, what it is that you're dealing with, what things you might want to change so that you can actually broaden the palette of trees. Then you can look at species. But to pretend that selecting a tree species is going to eliminate all the crap that's been thrown on the ground and all the layers of rubbish that people have left there, that's going to be our supposed home for trees, we've got to change that. We've got to change the way that people think on that front. It's about, that doesn't work. We've been sold a furphy that tree selection is going to solve all the problems. Rarely does it ever do that. And I guess making evidence-based science your partner is really what a lot of this is all about. If we don't, we end up with some silly outcomes, really. Things like that. Some strategies for successful integration: structural soils, load-bearing soils. There's aerated soils as well that we're working on also on this front. It's a very useful way of being able to get air further down than you otherwise would in a soil profile, as well as the other benefits of being able to traverse over the top. Load-bearing cells, you know all about those too. They've got their limitations. Once you step outside of what's been designed as the rootable soil zone that's in that box, you then got roots interfacing with the existing landscape, whatever's there. The same old problems can start arising again. So there's things to be mindful of. That applies for for structural soils as well, and for aerated soils also. Aggregate paving, or paving over aggregate, essentially, is a really good way of being able to. You're right. Is a really good way of being able to manage roots that are constantly flicking up pavers or footpaths and that sort of thing. There's a bit more on that in a minute. But mimicking nature and how we, at the moment, there's so much hardstand. I don't know how effective this is or how important this is here, but certainly in Perth, we've got just acres and acres of hardstand. It's great for harvesting water, but we just throw it into a pit and pipe and send it out in the ocean. About 70-80% of our storm water ends up being in the Indian Ocean, and so we're not actually capturing that and reusing it locally. Which is what a lot of these permeable paving type systems can do. And once you introduce water, you start into soils, you start actually preventing that residual heat from being able to be the problem that it is in our hardstand urban city spaces. And this is in Hiddle Street. This is Tim Johnson, who some of you may know, but some of his work. And that, we're using load-bearing cells in Hiddle Street was very effective. The right-hand side, you can see the size. That's a jacaranda that's been planted in there. And here it is 4 years later. You can have some fantastic results. And done well, you've got root zones here that are actually going to be adequate. And they're in a confined space. The way that they've been held in check is, we'll find out over time just how that really works. But just using aggregate, and a good example here is, and again, this is part of Tim's work in Mitcham. But the aggregate like this underneath paving, here this is a Manchurian pear. It's got about a 350 caliper. It's 12 years old, and not a brick was moved. We just pulled it up to have a bit of a look, and you can see how it's influenced where roots grow in that lower section. So you don't get those roots sitting underneath it, underneath the pavers that cause the splitting or the spitting that's a trip hazard. But this aggregate like this, it actually changes the way that roots grow. So you don't end up with the normal sort of root system, if you like. You end up with a mass of fibre that's all over the shop. It travels for many, many metres. From here to there could have about 3 or 4 metres of actual root zone length that you wouldn't have. This is absorption roots, not just arterial roots here. And so you can end up with a whole lot of space that actually stabilises ground. Doesn't make it more of a problem. It actually works the other way. So here's where engineering and horticulture and arboriculture actually are a win-win. Aeration layers, we do a lot of this with just introducing aeration layers so that things can be built over the top. On the right-hand side, this is the beginnings of now a road's going to be built over the top of all this. But there's, it's easy to do, but it's very, very clever being able to have roots growing underneath some infrastructure that's going to be put in play. And part of this isn't it's not forever, but it can keep roots going for another 10 or 15, 20 years sometimes, and they just re-establish somewhere else where it's more suitable before these ones die off. It's a slow death of some roots, gives the tree the ability to grow roots elsewhere. This is near the Optus Oval, a new one. And this was all turf area. And down the right-hand side there, actually, you can see roots running underneath. This was all park originally. But there were bollards being put down there. So this was, when they had the scare for, what's it called, the 9/11 type of stuff. That there might be people trying to kill masses of people. And so there's going to be there's bollards being put in here that can actually stop a tank so people can't crash into the thousands of people that come walking up and down this new pathway. But here we are talking about the trees and retaining those, and this has been really successful. The trees are actually happier now than they were when there was grass there. So it's crazy. And the other thing is that trees can actually dine out. They can, a tree can be here and it's got its roots in that garden bed over there. We can actually deliberately allow that to happen. It happens naturally, we don't even think about it, but we can design that so that around the tree you've just got your roots for stabilising that are important, facilitate those. The rest of them could go anywhere. They could be on the other side of the street. It really doesn't matter. The tree doesn't care. But we could take advantage of those in city spaces. You don't have to, there's not this symmetry of roots. There's asymmetry everywhere. It happens normally. There we are, trees can dine out. After having a little chat with Gary on the way here too, I'll put this slide back in, because most of these things, the root barriers that are installed, certainly in sandy country, they just do not work. And it's very debatable whether they really work in heavier soils as well. But by and large, they are just an absolute failure. Psychologically, they can be a good solution for lots of people, but they're very short term. And in fact, the installation of these in itself usually aerates and causes the very issue you're trying to prevent. around these things is where you'll get most of your roots. They'll grow under, over, or proliferate along. The plastic itself creates it's not a moisture barrier, you end up with condensation, but different bulk densities, and so you've always got a bit of a moisture gradient against these things, and you've got roots growing there. So in some cases it's good to have the roots there, but by and large they're put in to try and prevent the roots from progressing. We've had more success with a compaction trench. So just using standard old road base, whatever it might be, and installing it in this fashion, and we have a Fortress 5, it's a barrier that gets put along the top edges to stop roots getting underneath whatever the surface might be, and however that finishes. And that's pretty much a bulletproof way of doing things. And each time, as you're compacting, as you imagine, as you compact this road-based material, you're also compacting around it, the soil around it. And so what roots get there will start to meander off and go in other places without being attracted to anything. Yeah, so getting back to AS4970, part of this too, it could be, it's really about managing roots. And as I mentioned before, we can manage roots to be within a confined space. We can also manage roots to stop going into places. There's lots of things we can do around pipes and services and what have you that just stop roots from actually being there, being present and causing the expansion that causes the problem. You know, roots as they grow through the ground, they can barely, they wouldn't even be able to push that glass along. But it's the secondary growth, it's the expansion of this size to that size, that can exert 3 or 4 atmospheres of pressure, or up to 15 atmospheres of pressure for some species. Now that, if that gets caught underneath an edge, it can have an influence. And then once it starts to cause a crack, other roots will start to get in there and use that space because it's aerated, it's moist, you've got condensation, all the wonderful things. So roots will get into that space. So, it's just the mechanics of how things work here. Most of the time we've introduced and we've invited roots into what it is that we've built. The way that we build roads and paths and stuff are the very thing that creates the circumstances for roots to grow there. So AS4970, it's about working within the TPZ, not trying to keep people out of it. Trying to tell people to piss off, don't have your stuff here, it's never going to work. We're in a city, there is limited space, and we've got to be able to facilitate and have services and things with us. Just a quick one, at the Indigenous School of Indigenous Studies in UWA in Perth, and I've stuck a couple of photos together here to try and make that up, but that's how things sort of finished up here, really successful. The trees in the background on the left, you'll see some that are now almost 4 metres tall. This was 2-3 years ago now. They have jumped away. Other stuff that's been put in, 200 litre containers, were already 3 metres high. Today they're still 3 metres high. Things that have been grown properly, good root systems, they rocket away and do well. But these were existing trees, the front 3. The one that's in there, it goes through the roof of the walkway, and the roots are down in this bottom section here, and lots of root zone protection that went on for that to happen. That was the site before. Sorry, this is looking, if I go back, this is looking, we're now looking into what the camera shot is from the next shot. But that's how it started off on that particular part of it. We adopted this whole process of getting involved right from the master planning, did the preliminary works, the design review. The whole building got changed because there were certain trees in certain spots that were, if you shift the building this way or change the shape of it, the architects, everybody was on board. And what was marvellous here, I'll just go through it, there was consultation with the elders and the local Aboriginal people involved. And they had this beautiful story about, no, that tree there, that's the grandparent. They're the grandparent trees. There's the parents, here are the kids, they're the grandkids. This is all part of the family. And whoa, you start looking at what they were pointing out, and it just made sense. And the designers and the architects, they got it. And so things got moved, shaped, changed. And trees that were going to be kept end up being bulldozed. There's got to be a footprint for the building. But it was a wonderful process. Some of the seed was harvested off the trees that were being lost, and that's what was grown on 18 months later, put back in again. So quite a process and a good one for arboriculture, really, in how to exercise AS4970. Here's another part of it, and these were footings of a decking. So it was just being really meticulous on where these footings have got to go, because there's so many of them, that we didn't want to smash up too many roots. So the decking goes, the roots were going all the way to the building, and so this was investigative digging to where the footings might go. That was the end product. Here's all the deck in the foreground, there are the trees in the background. Again, things are looking fantastic. 3 years later, but in other sites, same sort of thing's been done without these levels of arboricultural control, and the trees are stuffed. So here we started from ground level, did the visual assessments, preliminary design, those sorts of things. There was further investigation. We did the ground proofing, just root zone investigation. Where are the roots? And that's what really made the changes, because everybody can see that. It's evidence-based science. You don't have to be an arborist to actually see, here are all the roots and there's none over here, but they're all over there. Oh, maybe we should put our building here. It's those sorts of things, and if they're involved, if other parties are involved, they get it. They can start owning the problem as well. So some takeaways is engaging modern arboriculture in the planning in the early stages. The planning and the design phase, don't underestimate how powerful that is in decision making that hugely influences the outcome for trees. So be at the table, get the right people there, develop the right people, develop the relationships to be at that place. The investments below ground, you've seen that, and that gets expressed in the documentation. The documentation for people to build things when there's trees involved is they need to be instructed on what to do. Saying just don't cut off the big roots doesn't work. We've got to be able to quantify what you can and can't do, and then put very specific directions around how that can be done. Because other people don't know how to do it. We might know, but they don't. We need to provide that to them. And at the end of the day, if we don't do that, there's no budget. If this comes in, it's got to be built in. So whoever's pricing this up, they've got some idea of what they need to allow. That the fig on cloisters on St George's Terrace, that big $2 million, $3 million fig, there was $60,000 spent just on the ARB components to work with the design, the construction people, right through to maintenance and aftercare. When you've got an asset that's worth that sort of money, that's okay. But you've got to cut your cloth accordingly. A single tree in somebody's backyard, you might spend $2,000 or $3,000 to do to get the same sort of outcome. But look for solutions that actually integrate and deliver the whole chain of events. So looking for outcomes and not just running the contracts. Very hard to do, particularly in local government, where everything does get segmented. That's a challenge. I'm not sure. I haven't got an answer for that one, but just recognising that there's the planning, design and documentation flows through into the fieldworks and the aftercare. And just being mindful of the time frame. The solutions we're looking for aren't for 100 years. They are, though, for 5 to 25 years. Most roads, most paths, those sorts of things, they have a life. Most of it circulates around about the 25, 30 year mark. Solutions for trees should be the same. Keep them in the same context. Evidence-based science, what it means, dig a hole. Just have a look, get a soil profile, look what that soil profile is telling you. To get a few of those around the site, you'll see what sort of layering is going on, what space, where roots occupy, where they grow, what they enjoy, what they don't. And you can soon start drawing up a bit of a picture. You don't have to expose everything, but you can get critical points where there's going to be certain things, or where there's already existing things, verify. That's where the roots are, or no, they're not even there. Or underneath this, there's nothing. Verify those sorts of things, and suddenly you've got real valid information. And it enables people, in doing that too, and the whole thing about this is I think, is about getting other people to be champions. Not just we're heroes, it's getting other people to be champions in looking and solving some of these sorts of problems. So a spade, an auger and a vacuum are pretty much the basic tools that we use for getting a lot of these things done, and it's extraordinary the amount of information you can glean from that other people can interpret. Quoting things from references and stuff like that, again, it goes back to it's a very narrow band that these things actually apply. We shouldn't be using them as a general rule of thumb or anything like that. And the other thing about this is this ruler, the 5 to 10 year ruler. So look at what happens 5 or 10 years later. Look at the outcomes that have been generated, and actually quantify that. We're not doing it. We don't look at failures. We don't record failures. We don't record tree failures. It's, we like to get a pat in the back and all sorts of praise for planting 2,000 or 3,000 trees or 10,000 trees. But most of those trees, half of them are just replacing things that have already died. The other half of those might perform reasonably. The other half of those might do really well. But that's sort of the trend. Quite often, we're just planting more trees and not changing what we're doing. We're still ending up with the same dodgy outcome. But if we start measuring and put that 5 and 10 year ruler, in 10 years' time, you'll see whether that tree was really fit for purpose or whether that site was really fit for that tree. 5 years you can usually tell, 10 years definitely. And use that. And for landscape architects and for architects, they're the ones that need to be putting this measure on there too. So it's not, it's not just you being the policeman here. It's get other people involved to have a look at what's behind them. Landscape architects and what they've left behind, a lot of it is disgusting stuff. We shouldn't be allowing it to happen. But where's the evidence to say that we've got to change it, or how do we change it? We're not recording it. And that's what we need to do. I'll finish there. Thank you. Can you, where roots already exist or there's an existing tree, can you extend that to get roots to go somewhere else so that you can actually destroy some roots in some other spot, I guess is what that's leading to.
You refer to it as a root canal?
Yeah, it's sort of a root channel, root canal. A lot of people start going, oh God, that hurts. But no, it's really, and look, there's simple things to do, and it could be as simple as just putting some aggregate on the ground with some geotextile over the top, and it just creates a circumstance, and if it's got a moisture gradient that's associated with that, fantastic. You'll have roots that just follow that, and it's air, it's not just water. As soon as you introduce air into some of those zones, that's where roots will start to follow that channel. So it's not a PVC pipe necessarily, it can be, but by and large it's doing those sorts of things to be able to just know, and it'll change from site to site. Once you start to learn how to read the profiles that you got there, you'll know what depth to work at, and in some instances where the moisture gradients are going to be adequate to get that to work. But a lot of it is actually creating air channels, not water. Yeah.
Mr. Rogers. Yeah, mine's more a statement, Rob. Most arborists that deal with consultancy know when to be on site and when to, as part of the tree management plan and scheduling, monitor works. Unfortunately, we have an project arborist in some areas. We have very little say. Quite often we'll prepare a tree management plan, get signed off by council. One of the conditions here is engage a project arborist, they engage a project arborist. That's the last we ever hear of it. I think council needs to be better at putting conditions that say you've got to provide inspection report for every stage.
But that's the idea of the two-tiered ARB component input is that if you've got someone who's representing council as part of the project, and you can write it. The thing is, if you've got specifications you've written in, those specifications can include, as part of your management plan, you have to have representation from somebody from council, possibly, for certain at certain hold points. You can write it up. Whatever is going to be significant for that tree in that circumstance. Don't overdo it. Just pick the critical points where. This is a whole point. Until our consulting arborist has actually had a look at this and given you the tick, you don't progress from this point.
In most cases, unless the council puts a condition that they have to do it, most development.
Yeah, that's right. So it's got to be a condition of council. So it becomes part of the DA. And when it's written in the DA, they can't not do it. So, but we've got to have people at the other end that know what they're doing. And I think where this sort of falls over a bit is that. There's not a lot of investigation done to start with. It's been from a circle, and then when you come to validate things later on, when you're overseeing stuff, you find there's no roots there at all, or yes there is, but gee, crikey, you can't cut through that. Well, it's too late.
One of the issues in Melbourne, I'm not sure it's the same in Perth, but a permit isn't always required for demolition. So by the time the arborist comes in, it's like
now there is a permit for demolition, but. And again, if you get in early enough, that can be part of its forward works for a contract, and it's works that's going to be paid for. So whoever's overseeing all this is going to, you can, if it's part of DA, you can actually have a say in that space. But it's hard to get in the first instance, but we're not in the habit of doing it, and developers would rather push it all away. But for a local authority, at the end of the day, the local authority quite often inherits all this crap that's been sort of thrown around. They inherit it in the end. So it ends up being a big fight at the end, and with a big stick saying, oh, we want you to replace this and all sorts of things. And there's lots of dollars that are spent, many, many hours of people's time spent trying to actually resolve disputes. This is one way of actually getting that dispute sorted in the first place, so that when it gets to the end, it's pretty clear cut what has and hasn't been done, and there's no arguments. It's pretty simple. And the other thing is, everybody's happy with the outcome. It's nothing worse than having a big project that's gone on for 3 or 4 years or 5 years for some of them, and at the end of it, it's just a heap of shit. Nobody really likes it, nobody wants it, but council's going to have to inherit it, whether they like it or not in one sense, and they're not happy. It's terrible. This is being proactive and actually getting involved in the first place, and you can be really a lot more specific on just some major points that make a major difference. There's a detail that we'll never get to cover, but I think in terms of difference, can make 70-80% difference by getting in early. We've shown it with some of the projects we've been involved in. It's been really good. More?
One more question?
Yep.
You mentioned adding air and water into the soil profile and encouraging it to develop to that space.
Mm-hmm.
But you also talked about non-destructive root investigations and aiding the process to construct and find out where they are.
Yep.
Are you then creating that issue, even though it's a positive thing to look where the roots are, you're encouraging them to go in there anyway?
Oh, look, some of the investigations you could be encouraging roots to be in places that you've investigated, yeah. You could also be destroying roots, just trying to find out what's there. My point is, well, if you don't do it, you never know, and what decisions are going to be made. There's got to be evidence for the making some of these decisions. Exposing roots isn't about exposing everything. It's just there's particular alignments for a building or for a car park or whatever. There'll be certain alignments that are really critical for construction. And then there's protection of other zones. Now, which zones you need to protect, which ones don't you? And so you're just doing spot sort of investigations. You're never having to look at everything. But by looking at a soil profile, by doing your potholing, you can see what's going on. You can see where roots are actually occupying space and the sort of roots that are there. Where are they absorption roots or are they just arterial roots? For a lot of our eucalypts and things, the tree is here. We've got jarrahs, for example. I've dug them up in Kings Park, gone from here to that garden bed, and haven't even found an absorption root. It's just arterial. Their feeding is way beyond the tree itself. The roots that are sitting around a tree and that in the bark of these trees, they're from other trees. And once you look at them, you think, oh, gee, there's lots of fine, absorption roots in this zone. Have a proper look and follow them. Quite often, they're actually just growing in the offal, in the bark of other roots. And they're not associated with that tree at all. They're just taking advantage of the space. So for a lot of our forests and stuff, when you talk about the Aboriginals before and the families and stuff, how much they nurture each other as trees and how they exchange things through their root system. It's quite phenomenal. Urban ecology, we're only just starting to really understand some of these things and how they really all mesh together. There's lots to learn. It's fantastic. So, good question. Thank you. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.